to, great, so we're recording this. So I'll start again. Health technology assessment. So what does that mean? Well, a health technology is a medicine, a medical device, or a diagnostic. And it's assessed to see if the health technology should be used within a public healthcare system or a funded healthcare system. If it should be used and paid for, how should it be used? How best should it be used? And ultimately, which patients do we think are most going to benefit from this new technology? And so HTA compares the new thing, the new technology, the new medicine with what's already available, and basically ask that question, how is this better than what we've got today? And the process of HTA, I'll just step through this slide really quickly. This is sort of a generic process I'm showing on this slide. But what normally happens is that the body that does a health technology assessment will ask for evidence to be submitted. That evidence is submitted by the pharmaceutical company, if it's a medicine, for example, but they also increasingly go to patient groups and say, can you also submit evidence to the committee? At the committee meeting, you will often have patients or patient representatives in that committee meeting to answer questions or to give testimony. Usually after that first committee meeting, there's a sort of interim decision made, and the health technology assessment body will say, okay, we think this is going to be our decision. And then there's a consultation period, usually involving those people that have inputted so far. So if a patient organization has input into that evidence at the beginning of this process, they'll usually be part of that consultation. There's a final committee meeting where everything is sort of decided and finalized, and then the final decision or the final recommendation really is published. And in many systems, there is an appeal process. So if people are really unhappy with the recommendation made, then it is possible to appeal that recommendation, but that is quite a difficult process to go through in many countries. And so this evidence submission, this pink box, the second box along here, what kinds of questions are health technology assessment bodies looking for? I pulled this from the Scottish example, but actually these questions are pretty standard now around the world. So questions similar to this are asked by each health technology assessment body if they involve patients. So it's worth just saying that not every health technology assessment body does involve patients. So they want to know how the condition affects day-to-day life and how current medicines, not the new medicines, but the current medicines, how they work and how they help with the condition. They sometimes want to know if the patient organization has been able to speak to patients who have tried the new medicine, maybe on a clinical trial, for example. And then they want to get some opinion of how this new medicine might be expected to improve the lives of patients. What impact would they have on family or carers? And then a really important question is question number 6 here, is they also want to know if there's any disadvantages of the new medicine. And so they want to understand if there's anything in particular that patients are worried about this new medicine. And that's really my overview of HTA just in 3 slides for those of you that are new to this area. But what I want to focus on over the next few minutes is an overview of the research we conducted towards the end of last year. And so what we did was we wanted to focus on one of the new biologics and just focus on that one medicine and look at it from several HTA bodies' perspectives. We identified reports from the Health Technology Assessment Body that were in the public domain. We picked reports that were in English because that allowed us to easily pull out the key inputs without having to have translators. We looked at what were the concerns from the Health Technology Assessment Bodies. So what questions did they have about this new biologic, and what learnings could we take forward? So we picked dupilumab, which was a new biologic for treating atopic eczema. And we looked at We looked at this because it had been reviewed by several health technology assessment bodies, so it allowed us to compare and contrast different systems. They were all looking at the same indication, so it allowed us to do a like-for-like comparison across different health technology assessment bodies. Covered several continents. Each of the health technology assessment bodies had some patient involvement, so it allowed us to look specifically at the patient involvement. And it happened a few years ago with these reviews, so we could see if anything had changed, if there was new evidence presented and anything had changed. And as I say, everything was done from public available documentation. So we looked at NICE in England, so that's at the HTA body, the Health Technology Assessment Body in England. We looked at the Canadian Health Technology Assessment Body called CADETH, and we looked at the Australian one, PBAC. And what we saw was pretty much a consistent process here, was that initially, when the HTA body first started looking at this medicine, they were pushing back and saying, oh, we're not sure about this. We think we need more evidence, or we're not sure about the evidence, or we're not sure about the patient population that's to be covered here. So the initial rejection started to happen. And this happened across all of these three countries. But then with the submission of new evidence, a lot of input from the patient community, from the patient advocate community, and I'll focus on that in a minute. A lot of those decisions were overturned. And in all these cases, those decisions were overturned. But it's worth saying that when they were overturned, there were still restrictions put into place. So it wasn't the case that the Health Technology Assessment Body said, great, we're now convinced that this can be prescribed to patients, all patients with atopic eczema. They said, yes, we do think it can be reimbursed, but for particular groups of patients, especially those with more severe atopic eczema. And so what did we learn when we looked at the documentation there? We saw that the key drivers of the decision, both negative and then positive within the Health Technology Assessment Body, was understanding the patient population that were going to have access to this treatment. And so they wanted to be really clear that they understood exactly who would get this treatment and who wouldn't get this treatment. And that's a way of them being sure about how many patients are going to receive within a healthcare system this new treatment. What was really clear in all these cases is that the patient group submissions, so the information from the patient community, was really key in helping the committees understand the impact of atopic eczema. And we saw no pushback from the committees around this. They completely accepted the information that was provided by the patient community that told them just how difficult it was for day-to-day life to live with atopic eczema. So that was really good input from the patient community. Where they did have challenges was sometimes around the rest of the evidence. So some of the HTA bodies said, you know, we're not convinced that in the clinical trials that the right comparator, what you're comparing the new drug with, to the standard of care in the clinical trials, we have questions about that. Or the different economic models that are submitted by companies, they were also challenged in certain cases. And that often led to some of the rejections. And then as new data and new models were submitted, that helped overcome the challenges and allowed for reimbursed access. And when we focus on the impact of the patient groups, what we saw really clear was the patient group submissions were really well focused. They were really clear on being specific about the impact of atopic eczema, and very, very clear on what is wrong with the current treatment options that patients have for atopic eczema. And as I said before, these insights were not questioned or challenged by the committees. They really started to understand the impact of atopic eczema. I think, as I've mentioned before, what we have to remember is patient groups inputting into HTA processes is there are often other factors that can lead to a negative decision. Questions around the data and the evidence, often they can be the drivers of why there is a negative decision. And really, I want to emphasize that these kinds of drivers, they fall outside the scope of patient group input. There's nothing that patient groups can do to fix that if the HTA body really has a challenge with the clinical evidence or the economic evidence. Especially in the UK example, the third point I want to make is the patient groups were really clear that this was the very first biologic to come along for atopic eczema. And so therefore, there was a need to recognize the innovation that was here. And in the UK, they changed the language of their final decision to recognize that that was a true innovation. And that sets a precedent, I believe, for access to reimbursed biologics in future, not just for atopic eczema, but across other dermatology conditions. And that's the end of my slides now. I hope that's given you a reasonable overview of that research. It's available through GlobalSkin, and you can see more details in the rest of the document. But I'd really like us to go to the panel now. So I'll stop sharing my screen so that we can see each other. And I'd really like, first of all, I'm going to pass over to you, Rachel. I mean, I know you were involved in some of these processes that we've talked about here, and just if you can just give us an overview of how you think about this and how you look forward to what could change in this area.
Absolutely, Neil. Thanks very much. And thanks very much to GlobalSkin for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So I'm currently the executive director of both the Canadian Skin Patient Alliance and the Canadian Association of Psoriasis Patients. Those are two separate national organizations here in Canada. And I come to this role with a background as a lawyer. I was a lawyer for Health Canada, which does the drug product regulation here in Canada. And then I spent several years as a consultant helping people navigate the HTA process. And Neil, your description was beautiful. There are a lot of things that you were describing about all of the different opportunities we have in Canada to engage with this process that are actually really new. They're really new to us. And so when we contrast, for example, the first time for this specific drug, the first time that went through HTA here in Canada, we didn't have the opportunity to comment on a draft recommendation. That was not available in Canada through CADIF. It was when it was resubmitted, I believe. It was starting to change, I should say, well, by the time that was resubmitted and that decision was looked at again with the new evidence. And you rightly pointed out that there were some gaps and some concerns that the review panel had. And so one of the things I remember looking at the recommendation the second time around and being really frustrated that by the time they got to the economic analysis, it was clear that all of the comments we had, so I should be clear, the second time around, that was actually an indication that included 12-year-olds and up. So it was also different from the first time around, that was just adults. And so the second time around, you have a lot of teenagers, especially young teenagers. My kid is 13. And we all, any parents on the line, we all know how much of our lives are wrapped around making sure our kids are healthy and doing well. And so one of the things that I found really frustrating was they listened to our input. They reflected our input about how caregivers were impacted, and specifically parents. We included a lot of first person testimonials. We like to include as many quotes, direct quotes, as we can to really let people speak to CADIF, and also to make sure that CADIF is hearing directly from people who are impacted and not just from us as an organization. So we did have a lot of first person testimonials from parents who were like sleeping beside their kid's bed to hold their hands so the kid wouldn't wake up at night and scratch themselves till they bleed, because that's what was happening. That's an example. So we know that there are a lot of impacts on caregivers. And when we started to look at the economic analysis, caregivers were not part of it. So they got it, but they didn't really use it. And that's one of the limitations that can be really frustrating as a patient advocate, to see it, like, it really speaks to the depth of their understanding of what we're telling them. And so that was frustrating, but we were glad that it was given a positive recommendation. So, and I will also add, here in Canada, we have such a fun health system. And by that, I mean, we actually have like 13 health systems. And so CADTH takes care of most of them, but there's a specific province here in Canada, the province of Quebec, and they have their own HTA process. So every time that a new drug is coming forward and they want to have it listed on government drug plans, it goes through both CADTH and INESS. So we do 2 patient input submissions every time this comes around. And then afterwards, after CADTH reviews it, INESS reviews it in Quebec, but I want to focus more on CADTH. After CADTH reviews it, there are other provinces that then will do their own analysis. So the province of British Columbia and the province of Ontario both do that as well. So there's multiple opportunities to share your perspectives here in Canada. And unfortunately, that hasn't, we're still not where we want to be. And I say this, recognizing the decades of work that have gone before these submissions by not only by our organization, the CSPA, but by other organizations here in Canada, in particular, the Eczema Society of Canada, which is an outstanding organization, passionate advocates. They've been working on this issue for a really long time. So when it comes to that question of sort of what are we seeing here in Canada, we are seeing that our patient input is being recognized, but it can kind of vary as to whether we really feel like it's being heard. And that's part of the evolution of HTA. And there are many things that we know when we look back, for example, on this specific experience of this specific drug going through CADTH's HTA process here in Canada. You can say hindsight is 2020. And what I mean by that is it's easier now to look back and say, oh, maybe we should have approached this differently or had this kind of happening in the background, changes to clinical practice guidelines, for example, that really kind of set the tone for how this is all going to fit together. But that's really, why it's so important that we have the opportunity for real world evidence to feed into these things. Because when we do HTA, when at the point in time where HTA happens is really a moment where we're relying on the clinical trial data and some of the studies that continue after the real bulky phase 3 kind of clinical trial happens. But there's a whole bunch of information that gets gathered in the real world, so to speak. And here in Canada, we're only starting to see that actually we're started, CADTH is developing a strategy for that. They're starting to move on that and figure out how to fold that in. And that's a huge piece. That's a huge piece, especially for atopic eczema, or as we call it in Canada, atopic dermatitis. And it's a huge piece for all kinds of different dermatological conditions and other ones too. Sorry, I think I took more than my 3 minutes, Neil. I'm going to pass it back to you because I'm really curious to hear what everybody else has to say.
No, thank you so much, Rachel. And you raised some really positive points as well about things changing and seeing just between that first and second submission, having more opportunity to input. And I think, that's certainly something I want us all to reflect on through the panel today is this idea of what's coming down the line, what's that future looking like. And so, Lindsay, I'm going to pass to you now so that you can give us, your views, from the industry perspective of how you think about this future and what's these trends that we need to be thinking through. So over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you to Jennifer and GlobalSkin for giving us an opportunity to speak on this panel. I also just want to acknowledge my counterpart at Regeneron, who's also on the line, Alana Tabak. So I am representing both of us today and our company's perspectives. Rachel, I was sort of furiously writing down things that you were saying because they were resonating so much with me as we think about sort of the future of clinical development from an industry standpoint. I think, you know, from industry's perspective, all of the things that you're saying are so meaningful in terms of just representing a patient's quality of life impact. And I think the limitation of a phase 3 clinical study is that it really just represents whether or not a drug is safe and efficacious. And sometimes that doesn't actually take into account, you know, what it's really doing in terms of impact on patients' quality of life. And sometimes that's lost in the conversation with HTAs as we get to that point of reimbursement. And so as we, you know, sort of look at the future state of clinical development, I think what's really important from an industry standpoint is that collaboration with patient advocacy groups and patients, and looking not at the point of the reimbursement discussion, but well before that point. And so I think we, you know, at Sanofi, and I know at Regeneron as well, you know, we want to partner and infuse that patient perspective into the clinical development program well before the phase 3 trial, with a you know, something in mind to really represent some endpoints that are patient related. So how do we incorporate some of those patient reported outcomes and ensure that those are part of the phase 3 readout, right? So that it's not just about the exercise of is the drug safe and efficacious, but really trying to answer some of those questions that you put up earlier, Neil, from the Scottish organization that really help to address whether or not the products that are going through these HTAs are impacting the patient's quality of life, and that those questions are answered as part of the data that's being presented as part of the package. And so from our standpoint, I think that's where we see the future. And I think, you know, we are trying now to infuse patient panels into protocol developments and really trying to represent the real patient experience before we get to the phase 3 trial. And I think that is I hope that is the trend of the future, and that those patient reported outcomes really do become part of the outputs, so that the conversations with HTAs are not just around the clinical signs and symptoms of the disease, but also really the real impacts on the patients, and that we are able to incorporate some of those not just clinically meaningful endpoints, but really what's important to the patient. And some of these, hopefully that in the future, that some of these discussions will not be as difficult, and that you know, patients will actually get better access to innovative treatments. So I think with that, I think that's really just my call to the patient advocacy community and our ongoing collaboration from industry partners, and really working together to identify people living with these diseases who are interested in providing perspectives, right, that can be included in clinical development, in the clinical development process. So, you know, our collaboration continues to be important, not just at the point of disease education or you know, at the point of approval or reimbursement discussion, but really much earlier in the process. Yeah, so I think that's really from our side what we how we sort of see this, and how we think that ongoing collaboration can really be and have a really impactful outcome for people living with these diseases.
That's fantastic, Lindsay, and you really reflect on a trend that I'm seeing across the globe and across disease areas, not just in dermatology, about, you know, bringing the patient perspective into evidence development, you know, and I completely agree. I look at this from a HTA perspective, and I see that the big question that HTA bodies struggle with in terms of the patient perspective is getting to the specifics. They want the specifics. They want to say, okay, exactly, you know, this condition makes your life difficult on a day-to-day basis. How does it make it difficult? Give me some examples. Those specifics are really important in the HTA process, and any evidence that can be generated that starts to capture that, I think, is going to be fantastic. And moving onto evidence even further, this is like a thread that's run through the whole of this thing so far, is thinking about what evidence do we present to HTA bodies. And I want to pass to you, Jennifer, now, because I know that GlobalSkin has been really working on this project to generate this kind of evidence. So over to you, Jennifer.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Yeah, this is really fascinating. I've taken a lot of notes, and I am seeing so many connections here. We are all very, I think, on the same page, even though we're coming from different perspectives. When our organization, GlobalSkin, was founded back in 2015, the number one gap, I think, that was identified by the patient organizations that attended that founding conference was the need for real world evidence from a patient perspective. The information we were receiving from those patients at that, or patient leaders at that time, was that, yes, they were being recognized, like Rachel said, recognized for putting in their submissions, but not heard. That really stood out for me, that when you said that, Rachel, because that's what patients and patient advocates have been saying. They're putting it in and they're being thanked and congratulated, but then what they've submitted is really not having that pull through to the final decision. And the reason for that, not in all cases, but in many cases, is that the information being presented by the patient organizations doesn't fit into the decision-making rubric of HTA. And what they're really lacking, I think, in sort of hearing from the patients, is going beyond the anecdotal evidence, which is really important. I think what Rachel said about, hearing those real voices, those real stories from real patients is really important, but they also need that quantitative, verifiable data. And so that's where the GRID project was born, from our very first meeting with patient advocates from around the world in dermatology. So that's the Global Research on the Impact of Dermatological Diseases project. And I think that probably everyone on this call is well aware of this project, but we have lots of information on our website if anyone does want to read up on it. But what we're developing is a new measure in dermatology from the patient perspective that measures the true impact of living with dermatological diseases. And patients and our patient organizations have been partners with us every step of the way. So this really does provide that information from a patient perspective, but with the rigor behind it that's required for it to be taken seriously. So we've worked with 2 research institutions, Hamburg University and Cardiff University, in developing this measure. And what we'll have coming out of this, not only the measure, which can be used over and over again, and we hope it will be potentially used in clinical trials going forward. But also we'll have this data that we'll be able to share with our patient organizations. So data sets that are particular to their country, to their disease, that they can then present to HTA, so that they are not just recognized, they're really heard, that this fits into the way that HTA makes their decisions. The other thing I just want to touch on, because this was raised by all, I think all 3 of you, is around the clinical trials. And I thought it was really interesting when you said, Neil, that HTA is looking for information about how patients did on the new treatment. And they may not have some of the information that, from a patient perspective. And I think that there is a real incentive there for patient organizations to get more involved with getting their patients to participate in clinical trials, because they can hopefully, if the industry partner or the industry company that's developing the new treatment is open to this, they can be part of setting those meaningful endpoints that Lindsay referred to, so that it actually makes sense to the patient that, okay, this is going to address my biggest pain points in living with this disease. And then that will make it easier for recruitment to the clinical trial. So a higher level of participation and success of the clinical trial. If the patient organization is involved in all those steps, then they're also able to monitor what patients are getting involved, and then to be able to start collecting that anecdotal information. So that's another gap and data that the patient organizations can fill that perhaps no one else can. So I think that there's a real opportunity there for a partnership to happen to help make these clinical trials a success, and then to be able to bring that information through to HTA.
Thanks ever so much, Jennifer. And, you know, so there's two threads that I've run through this actually from, you know, there's this evidence thread and there's this partnership thread, you know, and so what I'm hearing here is that as we step forward into the future, the real opportunity is to partner to make the evidence stronger and better, and to partner to find new sources of evidence or to strengthen things like the GRID project as that goes further. And so there's a real opportunity here that I'm seeing between all of the stakeholders, which includes HTA, and having open conversations with health technology assessment bodies to say, how could we be better? How can HTA be better? How can the evidence be better? How can the partnerships be stronger? So yes, we've taken baby steps in a way, because we've had this first wave, if you like, of new medicines coming for diseases like atopic eczema. But we're learning as we go through this process, and we're starting to spot what is missing and where the gaps need to be filled. For those of you listening to the panel, do chat in the chat, pose some questions if there's particular questions for any of the panel members. While you think about your questions, I'm going to pose one to the panel, each of you in the panel. And it's a very simple question, but if you had a magic wand, I give you the power to have a magic wand, and you wave that magic wand and you could improve patient involvement in HTA. So we've talked about patient involvement in HTA throughout this. What's the one change you would make if there was just one change you wanted to make? And Rachel, I'm going to start with you.
Good. I was like, I'm trying to keep my hand down, but I just couldn't. Excellent question, Neil. Excellent question. I love magic wand questions. I think that what I would really like to see, in addition to a lot of the good work that's been happening already around HTA and making sure that patients' perspectives are shared in their diversity and as directly as possible, I would love to see payers, because those are the ones that run the HTA systems, and patient organizations collaborating to help shape what real world evidence generation needs to happen. I get really frustrated, and I have for years. I don't think I'm that easily frustrated, but I get really frustrated when I see negative recommendations or even positive recommendations with a bunch of conditions on them. And I think, okay, so what do we have to do to make this better? Like what are the next steps? What's the call to action? And HTA processes are not set up. They're not designed to do that. They're designed to produce a recommendation to public payers, usually, although we do have it in the private system as well. CADIF is designed here in Canada to tell provincial, territorial, and federal government drug plans whether it should be engaging in negotiations to list something on their formulary. That's the whole objective. But what I would like to see is an objective that is adjacent to that, that is supportive of that, that says, okay, we're nervous about this. Because with all new medications, you're going to be nervous about something. That's normal. But let's identify what that is. Let's work with patient partners, and let's set up a system where we can be generating this evidence. We can be using the kind of measures that GRID has in the dermatology context, and where we can be building more information about what's going on for people. And that information would be incredibly valuable from a reimbursement perspective, especially for governments, because that's taxpayer money. And it's always good to be really thoughtful about it. But it would also be really amazing for moving to a more sort of holistic health system. So the way that we have it in Canada, drugs, like governments pay for drugs out of one envelope, and they pay for the health system out of a different envelope. So people are often making the argument that when people's condition, so in this case, atopic eczema, when that is better controlled, there are less visits to the emergency room. People are able to be happier, more productive. I sound like an old Radiohead song, but people are able to do more things. They're able to volunteer. They're able to be more engaged parents. This is about the human experience. And so, and that's important, but the only place that kind of stuff gets recognized is through the HTA process and those kinds of conversations. That does not get married here in Canada. That does not get matched with the health system and how we're funding the health system, how we're keeping people out of emergency rooms in this case, how we're keeping infections down, how we're keeping people from falling asleep at the wheel of their car because they're so sleep deprived, and they've been so sleep deprived for so many years, and then causing public safety. I mean, that's not a very common thing, but I'm just saying, like, there are other pieces to this. And I think it's very frustrating when we aren't looking at how to make the entire system better. As a patient, as a skin patient, I am not only a skin patient, I'm all kinds of other patients, but I'm a patient for all kinds of other reasons, but I'm also a mom, I'm a worker, I'm a boss, I'm a volunteer, like there are all kinds of other things that we need to be folding into the system. Okay, that's the end of my rant, Neil.
That's fun, Rachel. You covered an awful lot there, which is fantastic about the healthcare system. And I'll come back after we've heard from the other panel members about your idea of having a more flexible decision-making after the original HTA, because I think that is happening. Lindsay, what would you do with your magic wand?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not going to speak directly to like what can change within the HTAs, because I think that is that's a really difficult one to unpack, especially given just the diversity and the different types of countries and what's happening. But I guess I'll just kind of go back to my original comments, which are, I think that there's a different role that maybe we all need to play. And I just saw Bernd actually said it. What about dermatologists too? And I think we haven't really touched upon that as well, right? Like, I think the HCP also plays an important role in this conversation. And again, in the early part of that conversation, right? And sort of setting the right tone around that quality of life impact on the patient. And so I think, as industry, I think we need to do a better job of, bringing not only the HCP community along in that research journey, but also the patient advocacy community, and how might we better collaborate there so that there are opportunities to infuse some of that patient experience into the early clinical process. And I think if that, maybe if the magic wand is waved and some of those things are done, that maybe the conversation will change, right? And I think it's a starting point, at least, to try to change the conversation and to get more transparency on what is actually needed to ensure that patients have good access to innovative treatments and in dermatology and elsewhere. So
yes, and it's interesting, bringing this back to the dermatology level. I've been wondering myself, actually, do we believe there's anything specific about dermatology conditions that makes HTA difficult? And I don't know, Jennifer, if that's something that you've thought of.
Well, that's a really good question. And I think the answer is yes. And just through the process of doing our grid project, we have uncovered the construct that will make up the questionnaire we're developing, the new measure, and it's multifaceted. It's not just the physical symptoms. In fact, there's 5 different domains that we have uncovered. So there's the physical, but there's also the psychological, the social, the daily life requirements, and there's a 5th one. I forget what it is, but it involves your entire life. And these are not small impacts. In some cases, the psychological and social outweigh the physical in terms of what the patients have responded on our early research. And I think that does probably make it more complex to be able to assess the full impact of a disease when there are so many parts to it that perhaps people in HTA haven't really considered when they're maybe just thinking about the physical.
No, I think that's really, really important. And my observation of looking at those HTA reports was that there's genuine confusion about the different scales and measures used in the clinical trials. And part of that is because there's been so little innovation for decades in diseases like atopic eczema that the health technology assessment bodies, this is the first time they're looking at those kinds of scales and scores that are used. And they have questions about them. They have questions about, how does this scale compare to this scale? And are they the same levels that we're talking about? So they have very technical issues in dermatology that are emerging as these first wave of new medicines are going through HTA. Bernd, I have seen your comment in the chat, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to say to come online and say something if you want to explain a bit more about working with dermatologists.
Yes, thank you very much, Neil. I'm very sorry I can't share my camera because my eyes are very poor, so I'm glued to the screen, which makes a horrible camera angle. So I won't bother you with that. This is a fascinating discussion, and it's so important for patients. And there's two things I want to comment on. And one thing is including meaningful endpoints in studies. But I'm also a patient advisor for the European Medicines Agencies, and I also see phase 3 proposals which are stacked with questionnaires. So you also, and then you get lost data or not filled in data. So you have to be very careful what you put in there. For instance, what we did in another project was to investigate the workability of people who were having very poor eczema and were put on dupilumab. And we see a great increase in workability and also in work enjoyment and quality of work. But then it's post hoc, that's after that one is. The main thing I want to bring across is that in the Netherlands, we work very close together with Dutch Society of Dermatologists. We work together on several projects, but before the HTA start, we already made a point of view how to position the new medication. And we also were very realistic in that, is that we didn't say as a patient organization, we wanted it available for all. We narrowed it down also ourselves. It's not like we want everything on the menu and we pick as we choose. So together we made a point of view from both the dermatological point of view and saying that there are too many people, despite conventional immunosuppressives, are still having a high burden of disease. And we can complement that with what the real life is. And that came to a joint standpoint. It means that the dupilumab was, and we did that with the insurers and with the Dutch Ministry of Health, and it went so smooth. And what we also did is, we're going to help you to not open the floodgates, so to say, by monitoring every application for a new use of dupilumab in the first 2 years, which we did very carefully. So we said we tried also to be realistic, like it's a huge expense. I mean, and the increase of the cost of eczema is 25% only because of the biologics and the new NIPs. So it's a lot of money. So you also have to be realistic, what to do. And we have a great cooperation with the dermatologists. So you can stand up as one front, the caregiver and the one who receives the care, and give a complete overview from both sides. Because dermatologists are sometimes also wondering, like, what do I do with this patient? Nothing is helping, They are also sometimes lost. And I think there was an important point, I think, that also children were included, is that of course, things are measured in children when they are doing the studies, but they don't measure the work loss, the sleep loss, the quality loss of the carers, and the loss of income. And I'm seeing parents who are giving up their jobs temporarily, or reducing their hours, or maybe not taking the next promotion in their jobs. And these are the costs that are for insurers who are really paying the bill, say, yeah, these are indirect costs, they don't count. but they count in the whole picture, in the whole societal picture, I think.
They do, and that's such an important point, Bernd. And you know, it sounds like you've done excellent work in the Netherlands. I really like the idea of you doing this almost like pre-assessment yourself and working out what was realistic.
I think a part of that also goes out from the Dermatological Society, because they're open for it. You know, we are sitting at the table with every guideline, every standpoint, every project. We are invited, you know, to do it together, because together we are strong. Yeah, it sounds like a cliche, but it is. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really, really good examples that you gave us there. I want to just go back to something that you were saying, Rachel, earlier. I just want to just loop back with some of the ideas you were putting forward about, you know, HTA not being a full stop, if you like, but actually an opportunity to take more evidence in and to change recommendations. I see that that's starting to happen. It might not be happening in Canada yet.
It is. Yeah, CADTH just released its new strategic plan this week. And, you know, because CADTH has been moving from health technology assessment, which is like a point in time, to what do they call it, Neil? Sorry, health technology management, which is viewed as more of a life cycle of a product. Exactly. So that means that some things get to come in and some things have to go out. So there's a whole bunch of, there's a different perspective and a different approach that CADTH has been taking, and that we're starting to see moving in that direction as well.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing that in different ways. So those of you that get involved with HTA, you may come across a term where they say, we think we're going to go for a managed entry agreement. And you might think, oh my God, what is that? But that's actually quite a helpful process that they've started to do. Rather than say yes and no to various recommendations, they say, we're not that convinced, but we'll let a small population of patients have this new treatment, but we want to see what the real results are. We want to capture what really happens to these patients that get this new treatment. And we'll use that evidence to then see if we can extend and open up the patients that this is available for. So if you hear the term managed entry agreement or risk share agreement, they're sometimes called, it's nothing to be scared of. It's actually the HTA is trying to find a way to make this work, and not just to say no, categorically no to these questions. We only have a few minutes left on the panel, and we've heard about clinicians as being another stakeholder we need to be work with to get this right. Are there any other stakeholders that you think that we should be working with? This is to the panel. Sort of mentioned guideline setters.
In the context of HTA, what we're asked for is patient and caregiver input, and then they have a parallel process at CADTH and at INESS. They have a parallel process for clinician input, and again, for non-cancer drugs in Canada, it can be really tricky. It's still sort of newer in a lot of ways to get clinicians involved in that process. There's a lot of concern that if a clinician engages in one specific drug process, that they may be seen by their peers. This is my understanding. I don't mean to speak for dermatologists in Canada, but sometimes I'm concerned that some of them may feel that they will be viewed negatively by their peers for participating in some and not others participating at all. So there's a lot of, there's a cultural shift among clinicians that we're starting to see, but that can be challenging as well, because we aren't asked for anything about the safety and the efficacy. We're asked for whether patients want to tolerate those kinds of side effects or what they would trade off. But we're not there to give them that perspective. And they do tell us as well, you don't always have to give us data, because we'll go find it. We'll go find that data. We give them data anyway. We footnote the bejesus out of our, pardon my language, we footnote all of our stuff anyway, because we want to make sure that that information is getting to them. So I think that it can be challenging given the HTA process. Of course, in Canada, we also, CADTH does HTA, but then everybody has to go negotiate after that. So you mentioned managed entry agreements and risk sharing agreements. That's done by somebody else in Canada. So in some countries, they have the good, maybe bad fortune. I don't know. I don't work through those processes of having everything happen in one place. In Canada, it's a bunch of stops along the way.
Yeah.
And so unless and until payers are comfortable with actually setting up risk sharing agreements, managed entry agreements here in Canada, they're starting to be more comfortable. Those negotiators are starting to be more comfortable. That can also be a bit of a brick wall for some of these things when we have a lot of conditions and uncertainties around it.
No, I think that those are good points, Rachel, and the system is evolving. And I think that's a clear takeaway that people can take from this panel, is that even in the few years since these initial assessments that we were talking about at the beginning of this panel were made, we've seen processes improve. We've seen new patient organization engagement opportunities emerge in various HTA bodies. We're virtually out of time. So I'm going to ask each of the panel members to be very short here, but when you look forward to the future, you know, what do you hope we will have achieved, say 5 years from now, in improving systems for access to dermatology medicines? Rachel, what do you hope we'll have achieved?
I hope that we have a deeper understanding of what people who live with dermatological conditions, particularly moderate and severe forms of them, actually go through on a daily basis in their lives. And I hope that we have a health system that that includes access to care and access to treatment that is a little bit more holistic and where things work together a little bit more seamlessly.
Fantastic. Jennifer, what do you hope for?
I hope for a system that looks at the whole person and the whole family. So it goes beyond just the physical and takes into account all of the different types of impacts on that patient, their caregiver, their family, and society, that it becomes more of an integrated approach, and that we see patients that have better access as a result.
Thank you. And Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, I hope for all of those things as well. And I hope that sessions like this, I think one of the things that's been really great is it's a recognition of collaborations, not just with industry and patient advocacy groups, but as dutifully pointed out, dermatologists and medical societies, and each of us play a role in trying to create that future world. And I think it's just, really important for us to acknowledge that those collaborations need to happen. And I hope that sessions like this will kickstart that, and that becomes the model of the future. And that, I think that would really contribute to the future that Jennifer and Rachel have outlined.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lindsay. And my hope for the future is that we have more and more HTA bodies that do proper, meaningful patient engagement. So we want to extend that to every single country that has HTA, which is not the case at the moment. But I would like to thank GlobalSkin for inviting me to chair this panel, and myself thank the panelists for such fantastic insights over the last hour. But Stephanie, I'll hand back over to you.
Yes, thank you, Neil, and thank you for walking us through this this discussion. I think we learned a lot today, and I think we have a lot of commonalities and a lot of shared goals, which is wonderful to hear. Thank you, Rachel and Lindsay and Jennifer, for joining us and offering your perspectives, and a special thanks to Bernd as well for offering your perspective on the dermatologist inclusion as well. So thank you. We did sort out the recording, so this recording will be available for all of our members. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.